they want, well, it's very perplexing because they say they want to abolish gender, they want to get rid of gender, but like they're very insistent that our use of pronouns in the English language must track with chromosomes. They're very insistent that like anyone who's assigned one gender at birth like definitely has to stay within that box. And like it just seems like, it's just a position that sort of dogmatically refuses to consider the reality of trans people's lives.
But also the overlap with, you know, racialized notions of gender and femininity. There's been a huge comeback of, I think, like almost colonial notions of what it means to be a woman. Um, I've experienced a little bit of it from some of the, turf mob where they're like, we've clocked her. She's definitely a trans woman. Look at that 5 o'clock shadow on her face. And I'm like, look, I'm just Bangladeshi. Like, we all have that. Like, sorry, fam. And then you look at the treatment of Casta Semenya, which is
Lamp.
just this completely spurious attempt to police her out of the sports world despite being a cisgender woman.
Yeah, well, what's so fascinating to me is how, TERFs, they start with this position of like, oh, we need to like liberate females from gender, from femininity and stuff. But then like a certain conception of femininity ends up gatekeeping womanhood again, by their own position, which is why you get like the Drake Caster Semenya stuff, and like you have of course, once you start gatekeeping womanhood, and femininity is always going to be a part of one of the criteria, and then that's going to rebound against gender nonconforming women, against lesbians, against non-white women who are sort of, have to work harder. In other words, to get into what is like a kind of white framed vision of what a woman is.
Yeah, I mean, that's just also
Boom.
not gonna fucking happen. I'm just like, I
Yeah.
season my food and I talk with my hands. Like, the Bengali is not going away anytime soon. But, like, thinking about the historical context that lots of this, what you've identified as counter revolution comes in, is that particularly with the legal erasure of trans people and the sort of, trans moral panic that seems to be gripping both Britain and America, and in America to try and start finding coercive legislative solutions for it, is that it reminds me of the sort of 19th century homosexual panic, which in Britain culminates with the trial of Oscar Wilde. And then the reason why there's this obsession with imposing very rigid norms when it comes to uh, men and their expressions of sexuality and the sort of need to have this sort of like iron
Yep, I think I need to go check my laundry.
moustache and be ruthlessly heterosexual is because it fits in with uh, empire building. Really, it's like you're the kind of guy who can go out to the colonies and show these natives what for. So it happens kind of at the apex of the imperial project, whereas now in lots of ways Britain and America is having to deal with uh, geopolitical decline, and in America's case geoeconomic decline vis-a-vis China. And so that's the bit which doesn't quite make sense to me, which is what is the ideological purpose of policing gender and sexuality in the same way when the historical conditions are so different.
Well, one theme I've picked up on in some of this stuff is an anxiety about degeneration, which is actually also very old, and it's present in like in Nazi thinking, and also in a lot of 18th and 19th century kind of racist pseudoscience or sexual morality, is this concern that like the the population will be made sick or be made weak or vulnerable if we allow sort of effeminacy among men to propagate, or and so I think that this is maybe sort of an area of connection between the abortion issue and the anti-trans issue, where like basically bodies are sort of policed by gender according to this kind of vision of the population as a organism or something that's like the purpose of individual people is to um, serve this function that's going to men are supposed to work and to protect and all this stuff, and women are supposed to produce children. uh, well, women who have abortions and trans people are not fitting into this picture very well, and
There.
that's one of the motivations, I think, for, I mean, it's explicitly stated when you look at, like, the really far right people, like, this is basically just how they talk about it, but I think it's kind of there quietly all the time.
I mean, and there's this sort of racial undertone to it too, which is the idea that white people are being uh, bred out of countries in the global north, and so you have these, scare stories about, there's only one white kid in a school in Leicester and stuff like that to try and, you know, it really impose that sense of panic, and then it has repercussions for what the role of even white women's sexuality is. Um,
That's exactly how I see, like, this far right, the, like, structure of the far right worldview is that it's based on, like, sort of two threats. There's the external threat of invasion, right? That is, non-white people most of the times that we're talking about, who are are understood as, like, threatening the integrity of the people, the white people, but they try to avoid saying it so explicitly, but that's the sort of the thought. And as you say, yeah, these pictures of schools where it's like, oh my god, like, look at this school where 60% of the children aren't white, and you know this is supposed to cause a panic. And then the sort of corresponding threat is this threat from within, the decay, the degeneracy that's supposed to be resulting from things like queerness, homosexuality, trans people, abortion, extramarital sex. Any of this kind of stuff is viewed as kind of this, like, internal sickness that's weakening the race. Again, fascists will just say that, but in other types of far right people, they'll kind of imply it.
Code it cultural
Yeah,
anxieties,
cultural anxieties. Yeah,
racial self-interest, which isn't the same thing as racism, according to Eric Kaufman. That's my favorite one. I was just like, that's a lot of syllables to just say racist, man. Like,
yeah. Well, it's amazing the number of new words that we're gonna hear that just mean racism, but not that.
there's racially charged, like, lithium batteries, like it's not even racially charged. I mean, thinking this is kind of off topic, but I've got like a pet theory about sort of 19th century theories of sickness in society. Is that there's this sort of idea of the body politic, the project of empire, blah 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 blah, but also everything is actually about syphilis. So like my hot take is that picture of Dorian Gray actually about syphilis.
Okay.
So Dorian's portrait, aging in the attic, he's going mad, the sort of threat of contagion, him corrupting other people. So that's syphilis. It's definitely syphilis. There's a prose poem by Baudelaire called Miss Scalpel. So I think that's the translation of Madame Bistoury. And so she's this kind of like, you know, slightly
Massive
off
crush on that
kilter sex
sucker.
worker who goes to a doctor, and then it's the sort of reversal of the normal sex worker and client relationship, because she's like treating him as a sex worker and pays him in a way that makes him feel really weird. And I was just like, syphilis. It's about syphilis.
I think there's something to that. Like, I definitely think that a lot of forms of bigotry sort of have some psychological root in what is like a perversion of a kind of hygienic
Mm.
anxiety. Like, well, I mean, there's a reason why, again, like the AIDS crisis in the 1980s, like why this was such the center of of homophobic propaganda, because there's this kind of, there already exists this kind of natural anxiety about sort of who you have sex with. It's kind of, is this very commonly taboo thing in every culture, because it involves this crossing of boundaries between bodies that's not, that I think humans are sort of naturally disposed to form anxieties about, because
Is that really
of,
across
like,
cultures, or is that just ours?
hygienic reasons, right? Like, it's good for us to not, to be sort of squeamish about certain things. But I think that, of course, all that has cultural uh, conditioning as well. And so I think that, yeah, any way that you can associate, yeah, the target of your bigotry with uncleanliness, right? Genocide is usually preceded by talk about vermin.
Mm-hmm.
Again, it's a language of a plague.
I mean, the sort of interesting parallel with the AIDS crisis, which is sort of remembered, and rightly so, as a form of homophobic gay panic, is that it also overlapped with border regimes in a very big way. So you had the restrictions on travel from places like Haiti or Zimbabwe or South Africa, and the way in which there was this sort of idea of, you know, the virus spreading through like the presence of like quite literally a foreign body in the global north was, I mean, I kind of feel that's a little underexplored bit of that history.
Oh, I definitely think that's true. Yeah.
So I mean, before we wrap up, I always am wary of sort of ending on like a big old bum note, which is like, oh yeah, the AIDS crisis, that was really sad. Is thinking about spaces and reasons for optimism, because you know Hannah Arendt, when she's talking about how far right movements work, one of the things that she says that they do is that they alleviate loneliness, and there's a very, you know, human and natural need to alleviate loneliness. So on the left, where do you see cause for hope and optimism, and where do you see the alleviation of loneliness?
Well, I see a lot of cause for optimism, actually. I mean, as I said at the beginning of this interview, I think that like the intellectual dark web has lost its cool factor, and what I see having like the internet has absolutely changed in the last 3 years since I started doing this. YouTube has completely changed. There's like a
Puppy
whole
dog.
new this community of like leftist creators, and there's all these Discord servers and all these Facebook groups and all these, you know, there's this whole Twitter world. Like it's much, you know, it's I mean hundreds of times bigger than it was 3 years ago when I started. So there's a real alternative that seems to have gained a lot of momentum. That seems like a cause for optimism. Um, I think that there's sort of this building, like, you know, cultural sort of sympathy that seems to be growing with the, you know, anti-Trump and oh, you know, maybe back in 2015 everyone was kind of ready for a backlash because there were all these, you know, Jezebel articles about, is it racist to call Miley, or is it sexist to call Miley Cyrus racist, or like, you know, it, or you know, people were kind of
No.
like people wanted that, we're sick of the activists because we were annoying. But now, but now I think it's you know, the rise of Trump and what he's done has kind of made it clear that, oops, like the activists were actually right the whole time. And you know, it's too bad it took this to make anyone listen. But I do think it's having an effect, and I do think that, you know, when I look at the generation of people who are undergraduates right now, they are much more sympathetic to, you know, I think any kinds of progressive activism than they were when I was there, you know, 8 or 10 years ago.
I mean, I look at Generation Z in particular, and I'm just like, oh my god, like the future's going to be fine if it's in your hands. Like you guys are sick. Also, you've managed to work out how Snapchat works, which to me is like completely baffling. Thank you so much for taking the time joining us. I have really enjoyed this conversation.
You're very welcome. Thank you for having me.
Cool. Yeah, I'm excited for the most ambitious crossover event in left social media history. Or maybe it's not that ambitious. It's not really like you know, Varoufakis like joining Nigella Lawson doing cooking show or something. But it's not far off either.
We stand.
We stand.
Stand.
Nigella and Big Yanni. Thanks so much.
You're very welcome.
Well, hi there. I'm sorry, that was cringy. If you enjoyed this interview, please like it on YouTube. Please share it to your friends, your lovers, your family, and your enemies. And subscribe to us as well. Follow us on Instagram and on Twitter. And if you really liked us, like cash money liked us, go to support.novaramedia.com to give away some of your hard-earned cash, either as a one-off donation or as a rolling monthly subscription. And let me know who else you would like to see me or anyone else in the Navarro family interview. Bonus points if they're Anthony Joshua. I would like that very much.
Okay. Who's next? H-bomb. Climate denial. Measured response. It's kind of long. I don't know if I'm up for a 40-minute video. Oh.
Last month, I talked about Candace Owens and the alt-right's habit of constantly referring to Judeo-Christian values, generally as a way for bigoted Christians to cover up their own history of blatant anti-Semitism, while at the same time borrowing the victimhood of actual marginalized people, in this case the Jewish people, while at the same time furthering the marginalization of other groups, in this case usually Muslims. Well, wouldn't you know it, it's already popped up again in another prominent place, this time in an interview, or as the headline claims, a debate, it's really more of an interview, between Ben Shapiro and Sean Illing of Vox. It's really not much of a debate, but Illing does do a pretty good job of breaking down many of the ridiculous claims that Shapiro makes in his new book, The Right Side of History, from what I can tell is about how America isn't doing so great right now because we're no longer acknowledging our foundation of Judeo-Christian values. As a reminder, in case you missed my last video, the U.S. is not and has never been a Judeo-Christian nation. That phrase didn't even enter the popular lexicon until the mid-20th century. And even using the term that Shapiro actually means but can't say because it sounds as stupid and bigoted as it is, the U.S. also was not founded as a Christian nation with Christian beliefs or values. As Illing rightfully points out in this interview, Jefferson even edited his own Bible to get rid of all the supernatural shit. Christianity is not mentioned once in any of the founding documents for our country, and every attempt was made by the founding fathers to divorce religion from politics, since they saw how poorly that went down in other places like England. Obviously, everything Shapiro says in this interview and his book about Judeo-Christian values is a stupid lie. But I would like to draw particular attention to his very strange insistence that we should thank Judeo-Christianity, whatever that is, for science. Yes, all of science. Also, just a quick point of order, even though I do point out that Judeo-Christian is a stupid phrase and a stupid lie to use, I don't think that Ben Shapiro is stupid. Quite the opposite. I think he's pretty clever, which is why he tends to use the old Gish Gallop in this interview and in other places I've noticed. If you're not aware, the Gish Gallop is named after Duane Gish, a creationist, dead now, who also told a lot of stupid lies to a lot of credulous people, but who was himself a pretty intelligent person. He was famous for using debates to say so many wrong things so quickly that it would take his opponent hours to unravel and explain each one, rendering the debate absolutely useless. In a similar fashion, Ben Shapiro says things like the following in his debate with Illing. The belief that human beings are fundamentally equal, for example, comes from the Christian tradition. This is dropped right into Shapiro's reply to Illing, who is asking why he insists that America is founded on Judeo-Christian values. Illing can't even begin to address that because he wants to get back to Shapiro's false categorization of America's founding. Does the belief that human beings are fundamentally equal come from the tradition, the Christian tradition? We can't find that out in this interview because there's only so much they can cover. He's just dropped that in there. Note, though, that here Shapiro has dropped the Judeo from Christian. He says that this comes from the Christian tradition, probably because he has a slightly better leg to stand on, since New Testament Christians were some of the first to loudly and publicly insist that all humans are equal. Although the philosophy has deeper roots amongst the Stoics, for instance, and Muslims and Jews started preaching this same philosophy of equality at around the same time. It's not as simple as Shapiro makes it sound, but it's too complicated.
Comes from the mystery
the
religions tradition that it was part of.
When we're already dealing with Ben Shapiro's other lies about the founding of America. Ilian can't make Shapiro admit he's just wrong about the founding of America, but he does then solidly smack him down when it comes to Shapiro pretending that the Nazis had nothing at all, no connection with Christianity. And then they get into science, at which point Shapiro insists that science in the West wouldn't exist without Christianity. I'm sorry,
That's a
without
lie.
Judeo-Christianity, which, again, is not a thing. And I assume he also has to say it, though, because so many of our greatest scientists were, in fact, Jewish. And he actually says this line: "There's nothing in evolutionary biology that suggests that objective truth is even a thing." Imagine someone just dropping that line on you in a live debate. I mean, I had to reread that sentence a good 15 times. I'm still rereading it to try to figure out what it could mean. It's so nonsensical that it's not even wrong. It's like saying there's nothing in astrophysics that suggests that Santa doesn't exist. Yes, but also no, and also what? Ilian's response is really the only one that he could possibly give here. I'm not sure that's an accurate characterization of the scientific method, but let's not go down that rabbit hole. I actually did decide to go partway down that rabbit hole to just try to figure out what Shapiro is trying to say here. The best I can figure is that Shapiro is a presuppositionalist. That's a person who believes that no rational thought is possible without a basis in Christianity. Yes, this ignores the very long history of rational thought prior to the birth of Christ. Yes, it makes no sense, but there are a lot of people out there who believe it because they're desperately clinging to a religion that makes no sense in the broader context of scientific discovery, and they can't square that. Shapiro correctly says that scientists must make assumptions in order to explore our world. That's true. Scientists need to assume certain things about the universe in order to rationally study it. And Shapiro points out that one of these assumptions is the principle of sufficient reason, which is basically just cause and effect. Everything that exists does so because something happened before it. The mousetrap doesn't just magically fall at the end of the game Mousetrap. It falls because the boot kicked the ball that rolled down the ramp and into the basket. You get the idea. Cause and effect. Shapiro suggests that the principle of sufficient reason, or PSR, comes from our Judeo-Christian roots.
No, it comes from observation.
So incredibly wrong. The PSR predates Socrates, first being used probably around 600 BC. It's an absolutely essential assumption, because if you don't make the assumption that things naturally happen for some reason, then why bother to study the universe at all? How could the ancient Greeks figure out the circumference of the Earth back around 200 BC if they didn't accept the fact that the sun would cast a shadow on the summer solstice in two different cities at the same time? What if shadows just happen because God makes them happen? And what if a shadow today is going to be different from a shadow tomorrow just because God wills it? You can't do science under those circumstances. It's an absolutely bonkers argument for Shapiro to suggest that Judeo-Christians, who don't exist, are the ones who suddenly invented the scientific method and the entire basis of the scientific method. Even if the Judeo-Christians were a real thing, and if they did invent the scientific method themselves, their religion had nothing to do with it. The Bible does not in any way elevate or encourage scientific inquiry. It would be like giving Zeus credit for the Greeks' scientific discoveries. It just makes no sense. And Shapiro is exactly completely wrong in his understanding of the relationship between religion and science. Religion is at its heart an attempt to explain the natural world when we don't have the facts. Thunderstorms used to be God getting angry at us until we figured out what they actually are, and then God got a little smaller. We found out that he's not the cause of earthquakes, and he got a little smaller. He's not the cause of the plague or babies born with deformities, and he got smaller and smaller and smaller. Humanity's gods take the shape of whatever science has left to discover, which is why they're never going to go away. But that's also why science must constantly struggle against theocrats who are threatened by scientists explaining why their god is needed less and less and less. Illing did as good a job as one can in a discussion with someone like Shapiro, but for every point he was able to make Shapiro walk back, there were like 3 new little falsehoods that Shapiro was able to insert into the conversation. I'm not saying that it's pointless to debate people like Shapiro. I'm just saying that it's not an easy game to win, and I'm actually not even sure at this point that it's possible to win.
Shapiro is a fascist.
What was the first democracy in North America? I imagine your first instinct is to think the United States. Their republic was founded in the 18th century, and very often the way that Americans teach history, they think that they were the first democracy, or at least the first one since Greece. Though I imagine the more astute step-back viewers will know that if I started with such a simple question, that there's probably something going on. And there is, viewer. There is. You might have heard of the Haudenosaunee Confederacy. It's the name the people of the Confederacy prefer for themselves. Haudenosaunee means people of the Longhouse. You might know them as the Six Nations, or the Iroquois. Our story today is about the legend of the founding of this League of Peace and the resilience and future of the nations within this great confederation. According to the oral tradition of the Haudenosaunee, we begin with an Onondaga man named Hiawatha. His story is very much a legend passed down by many generations of oral storytellers. He was likely a historical figure, but with lots of edits and flourishes over the centuries. He lived during a time in history known as the Time of the Blood Feuds. It was a violent period before the unification of the Seneca, Cayuga, Onondaga, Oneida, and Mohawk. Violence from one nation to another sparked retaliation, which would repeat in an endless cycle of bloodshed. Hiawatha's story begins with tragedy. As an Onondaga warrior, he lost his wife and daughters to the endless conflicts scarring the land. The loss sent him into a deep depression, and he wandered the land, mourning. In his travels, he met Daganoweda, the peacemaker. The Haudenosaunee portrayed Daganoweda as a wise wanderer from the far north. He came to this land with a mission to end the blood feuds and bring peace. The two men met somewhere in the Mohawk Nation's territory, a nomad who wanted to bring peace to a war-torn land, and a grieving husband and father in self-exile. They both wanted to see an end to the war and violence plaguing the people of the Longhouse. But Hiawatha was in a deep depression, the loss clouding his thinking, and he could barely keep himself together. If he were to move forward to save those people from the endless cycle of war, he'd need to process his grief. Daganoweda taught him an important ritual still held in sacred practice today by the Haudenosaunee. It's a ceremony of prayer and song, used as a way to process grief for the dead. This was meant to replace a practice known as mourning wars. These were wars not for resources or territory, but for revenge, a part of their spiritual healing process. The battles included capturing captives to become spiritual successors of those they'd lost. The ceremony was one of the first concrete steps towards peace, a way to put an end to violence met with retaliatory violence and endless blood feuds and mourning wars that just rampaged every society and left everyone full of grief and hatred. This was a way to heal the wounds between these groups, and for the first time in a long time, make peace. The ritual requires a practitioner of a calm mind, one unaffected by grief. They would clear the eyes of the mourner from the tears to clear their vision. They'd open their ears to help them hear clearly, and their throat so that they may speak. The cloud of pain and suffering would lift, and reason would return. If the Haudenosaunee nations were entire tribes in mourning, clouded by the grief of endless cycles of violence, then the role of Daganoweda would be as a clear-headed outsider who came to this land to perform this condolence ritual for an entire country. Daganoweda had healed Hiawatha, and soon Hiawatha became his follower. They traveled along the 5 original nations of the Confederacy to spread knowledge of the condolence ceremonies. They immortalized the condolence ritual within an intricate pattern of beads on strings known as wampum. To this day, the Haudenosaunee use wampum to remember their history, traditions, and laws. They trace the origin of this practice to this moment with Hiawatha. The pair's first stop was the Mohawk Nation. From there, they moved west, spreading the knowledge of the condolence ritual. The Mohawks accepted it as well as the Oneida Nation. Their third stop was Hiawatha's home nation, the Onondaga. There, they met with a war chieftain named Atutarho. The legends say he had snakes for hair and wielded dark magic. If you don't choose to look at him literally, though, you can see Atotarho as sort of a counterpoint to Hiawatha, both of them representing the two things that were creating the great pain and sickness of the Haudenosaunee people before the Confederation. Atotarho represents the resistance and the legacy of all of the anger and hatred that had been pent up through years of war. Atotarho was also a chief who owed his position of power to war. He was a war chieftain, and so many before the founding of the Confederacy held their positions of power based on being part of the warrior caste. To stop the endless cycle of war meant to give up some of their prestige and their position. So while Atotarho represented the anger and the vitriol and the violence, Hiawatha represented the pain and the loss. Both would need to be overcome in order to build this Confederacy of Peace. And so when the pair went to see Atotarho, he rejected their proposal. They did not let this rejection defeat their mission. Soon, Hiawatha and Daganoweda met with the Cayuga and Seneca, who agreed to join. They returned to Atotarho with the 4 nations backing them. He still refused their offer. Unable to see past his own rage and hurt, the other 4 nations proposed attacking the Onondaga to force them into the Confederacy. But Hiawatha did not want a black mark on the birth of an era of peace. He offered Atotarho a sacred position, that of the Great Chief, or Chief Sachem. The Onondaga Nation would also become the home of the Grand Council. It would be the meeting spot for all of the nations to discuss Confederacy matters. And you know what? He agreed. The message of peace had gone through. From this moment, the Haudenosaunee Confederacy was born. After Atotarho experienced his own condolence ceremony, he and Hiawatha were as brothers. The early Haudenosaunee Confederacy was a massive power in the region. Their ability to cultivate the 3 sisters of corn, squash, and beans led to a vast population. Hold on, I think I'm getting a collaboration thing. One sec.
Hi, I'm Cogito. You can tell it's someone from another channel because the art is, better? I've made a video in collaboration with Stepback on the amazing agricultural technology that the Native Americans possessed. If that sounds like something that you're interested in, then head over to my video once you finish watching this one.
With this superior population, they were able to expand into regions less populated. That is, until they got farming as well, and even the odds. I will mention though, these archaeological theories clash with the Haudenosaunee themselves who dispute this. Things seem to be going well until the 15th or 16th century. The Haudenosaunee began to face their greatest threat, a force which threatens their existence to this day. They met Europeans. Historians dispute whether their first interactions with Europeans was in 1535 meeting Jacques Cartier or in 1608 meeting Samuel de Champlain. Regardless, they soon became well known to the French. The French would forego calling them the Haudenosaunee or the name of the nation they belonged to, opting for the name Iroquois. Contact was a disaster. The European diseases brought mass deaths to the Haudenosaunee people as well as every indigenous nation on the hemisphere. Estimates range from 80 to more than 90% of the population of North and South America. This mass dying represented about a fifth of the human population. In a never-ending drive to secure more hunting territory for beaver pelts, the Haudenosaunee launched a conflict against the French and their Huron allies known as the Beaver Wars. They purchased guns from their Dutch allies in modern-day Albany to fight back. Scholars now believe this conflict was a new emergence of the Morning Wars. They looked for people to bolster their population. Captives would become symbolic reincarnations of the many, many lost. Though they managed to dodge and even expand their territory, by the early 18th century, the Haudenosaunee were a major power in North America. They could play the rival empires of the British and French against each other to their benefit. Displaced from their homes in North Carolina, the Tuscarora asked to join the Great Confederacy, and they became the Sixth Nation. Today, you might hear the Haudenosaunee referred to as the Six Nations. Other nations became subjects of the Confederacy in something called overlordship. The Confederacy assimilated them as part of the Covenant chain. They were essentially made tributaries. During the 7 Years' War, the Haudenosaunee allied with the British against the French. After the British victory, they signed a treaty ensuring them land to live upon, which settlers could not expand into. Just want to mention, though, that many citizens of the 13 colonies both ignored this treaty and complained about it. Frustration over this curb on expansion, as well as many other issues from the 7 Years' War, prompted the 13 colonies to rise against the British in the American Revolution. The Haudenosaunee initially tried to keep neutral in the conflict. As the war dragged on, though, loyalties to the British or Americans split the Confederacy. They weren't able to recreate their great bonfire until after the war in Buffalo. But now, the nation straddled two separate countries. The Americans demanded through a series of treaties a majority of Haudenosaunee territory. The governor of New York tried to convince them to sell their land to white settlers, even exploiting an alcohol dependence epidemic to strong-arm them into giving up their ancestral territory. By the 1950s, the U.S. was still confiscating land from the Confederacy. After World War II, the U.S. began something they called Indian termination. They went through the act of trying to dismantle indigenous governments in favor of forced assimilation into American culture. They attempted to officially terminate relations on a nation-to-nation level. Nowadays in America, the legal status of indigenous people is a messy, oppressive patchwork of laws depending upon who could lobby for their existence. To this day, the Haudenosaunee government still exists. It still strives to keep a secure future for its people while resisting colonization. This is the crucial part of the Haudenosaunee Confederacy I really want to impress. They're still alive. We tend to conceive of the stories of indigenous people as being past tense, on this long era of decline, on this inevitable path towards oblivion. But they are alive. They are current. They have not just a present, but a future. And it's a future that we can all do something to make better. I want to give a huge shout out to my patrons, who, without which there would be no Step Back at this point. I would not be able to afford to do it. By the way, I'm very close to making Step Back my full-time job, which will mean more and better content for you. So if you want to be one of those fantastic people who want to step up and help Step Back succeed, who believe in its mission of improving historical literacy and combating reactionary abuses of the past, then please go to patreon.com/stepbackhistory and give as little as $1 a month. It all actually really helps a ton. But I understand if you're not a commitment type and you want to give just a one-time gift, maybe there was a video you particularly liked, then please, you can go to paypal.me/stepbackhistory and give anything really will help. And if you're unable to, or you don't want to help monetarily, trust me, I completely understand. You could help out Step Back by sharing a video that you like with a family member, with friends, with a community that you belong to, online or offline. It would really help. Word of mouth is really the way that spreads Step Back, because I'll tell you from the backside, the algorithm does not like this channel. Of course, go and check out Kogito's video down in the description, and come back soon for more Step Back.
Step Back history. There it is. That's not. No, it is. I am tired. I think I'll call it a night. Yes, my laundry is done, so I can finish making the bed.